So this is just a video for Luke. He asked for a little help with his septum stretching a while back, so I figured I would just make a video. So despite all the conflict behind it, pinchers and tapers are unfortunately going to be your best and easiest and most practical option until you get to about a 0. After 0, obviously, it's a little bit bigger size. You can tape much easier. And from there on out, I would definitely recommend that you tape and not taper from 0 gauge and up. But like I said, up until 0, I used pinchers, which probably aren't the best, but they were really all I could use due to the size of my nose, because most people have that little dip in their septum naturally that kind of aids them when using tapers, but I don't have that dip at all. Like, I can't insert a taper through my nose straight and then follow through with jewelry. It's just there's no room. So unfortunately I had to use pinchers, but they worked fine. I've never had a blowout. I've never had any serious problems. I mean, stretching to 0, it bled and tore, but then again, that was probably due to my bad decision making on the material of the pincher. Not to mention, it was a bit of a big stretch, so maybe you should go to 2 and tape, but whatever works with your body is probably best. Obviously, you don't want to force in any jewelry, just like with your ears. You don't want to do anything that you're not comfortable with, that you're not ready for, that doesn't go in with a bit of ease. Anything that you have to force in, probably just like with lobes, would result in a blowout. So I wouldn't attempt that. I've never personally had a septum blowout, so I really can't imagine how it would be trying to get rid of that. So yeah, just invest in some tapers or some pinchers or whichever you prefer. Like I said, until you get to 0, and then from there on out, you get to tape, which is where all the real fun begins. So taping, to say the least, is a fucking nightmare when it comes to your septum. I mean, Teflon, don't even touch Teflon when it comes to your septum. Teflon is horrible. It gets lodged up in your septum. You can't get it back out. It dries out. It's terrible. Don't use Teflon tape when it comes to your septum. The tape I would recommend, obviously, is bondage, whereas I would recommend that with any other piercing. But bondage tape is the tape you want to use when it comes to your septum. Okay, so there are obviously some pros and some cons to stretching with tape, let alone bondage tape. So the cons would have to be that it's sharp. It is, without a doubt, very sharp on the edges. It's a little bit tricky to fit in. It can be uncomfortable. Obviously, with the sharpness comes the risk of cutting yourself or lacerating the skin, making wounds, anything like that that could possibly cause infection or delay healing time. So the pros obviously are that it's not adhesive, it's not porous, it's glossy. It has a smooth gloss finish to it, which makes it very easy for insertion and taking out. Which, like I said, is a huge problem with other types of tape when it comes to septum taping. But overall, just be careful and use bondage mainly. So what I found works best is, because bondage tape is a little bit tricky to wrap around smaller gauge plugs, and of course because you're stretching your septum, it's not a huge giant plug that's very easy to wrap around. It's actually a small piece of jewelry that is a little bit tricky. No matter how good you get at it, no matter if you get a technique or not, it's always a bit tricky to get it on there and keep it on there, especially when you're trying to build an extensive amount of addition to your jewelry, obviously because you want to stretch with it. So it can be tricky. So what I find works best is you can use Teflon. I use Teflon usually as the first few layers. I usually get a majority of the girth or the buildup of tape is usually made up of Teflon, and then I'll do a few small layers of bondage on top of that to just kind of like seal it all up and give it that smooth finish. So that way I can still use the Teflon, which is easier to maneuver and use and tape with, and I can still have the glossy, seamless finish of the bondage tape, which feels much more comfortable on your septum. So obviously you're well aware with the miracles of jojoba oil and vitamin E oil. Definitely need lots of nurturing oils for your septum because it's a very sensitive area to stretch. It is a bit tricky with healing because let's face it, I mean, it's your nose. There's mucus and snot and all sorts of other bacteria getting built up in there, and it's just kind of a bad area for bacteria to grow. Well, good for bacteria, bad for you. So the vitamin E oil and the jojoba oil, anything nurturing like that, will obviously keep the health of your nose and your septum and your piercing, whatever you want to call it. It will keep the health of that as prime as you can get it. And then there's the more obvious things that you should avoid, especially when buying jewelry. You should avoid anything that's too long. Really get a good measurement for the width of your septum, because you want to buy jewelry that really fits well and it's not too long, because as you'll find with longer jewelry, I'm sure you know, is that longer jewelry, the posts cut into the inside of your nostrils, they dig in, they cut it up. It's bad, it's painful, it hurts, you don't want to do it. It discourages you a lot from stretching at all. So clearly, you want to avoid jewelry that's too long. Another thing that I would highly recommend is avoiding any jewelry with flares, whether it be double flared, single flare, anything with flares, just don't even buy it. It's not really going to fit. It's not like an earlobe. I mean, unless you downsized and try to stuck in a double flared piece of jewelry, it wouldn't really fit, because it's not like the earlobe. There's a large piece of cartilage sitting right above it that won't budge. I mean, aside from denting, it won't budge for a flare. It's definitely not going to go in. If you do manage to get it in, I can guess that there's going to be a lot of damage afterwards. It's just going to be a mess. It's going to be very uncomfortable. And then comes the painful part of trying to get it back out. With that being said, there is a lot to look out for when buying no flare jewelry, because a lot of people think that when they're buying no flare jewelry that they're good. They're all in the clear. Just because it says no flare, I don't have to worry about it anymore. It'll stick right in, be fine. Well, you're wrong. A big thing with no flare jewelry is a lot of no flare jewelry comes with O-ring grooves, which are great, work fine for your ears, very convenient. Septum, not so much. As you probably know, you can't really use the O-rings for septum jewelry. I mean, unless you have a giant nose with a huge cave for a nostril, you're not going to even be able to get that O-ring on the jewelry, let alone keep it on there and wear it comfortably. So since you can't use the O-rings, you kind of just have two big grooves on each side that could very easily irritate your nose, because the jewelry will slide, it will move, it will do whatever it wants inside your nose. I don't really think it'll fall out. Maybe your jewelry is different sizes, it all depends. But for the most part, it's not going to fall out. It's just going to move from side to side, shift in your sleep. Especially when you just freshly oiled it, your jewelry is going to want to move with you. When you fall asleep to one side, it's going to move with you. And that could be a problem with shorter length jewelry, but the real problem is jewelry with the grooves, like I said. So what happens when the jewelry shifts to one side is now the jewelry is no longer sitting in the center, so this flat wearable area of your jewelry is no longer on the piercing. Now, instead, your septum is pretty much clenching around that groove, and it kind of wants to shrink into it, but not enough to actually shrink a significant size. It just gets stuck in that little groove. And it can be painful to get out. It can be a pain in the ass. It can just be a huge mess that you generally want to avoid, depending on how long it's gone without noticing, all that stuff. I mean, tons of variables. But to avoid all the damage in the first place, just completely stay away from O-ring grooves and flares. What I've actually had to do, and I find works best, it's a little bit more pricey, but I order my jewelry custom made off Aesthetics Body Mod. And I get customized wearable area, I get customized sizes, and from there you can really, like I said, customize what you want on your piece. You can get it without flares. There's absolutely no O-ring grooves if you don't want them. So it all works out pretty well. Again, though, just be aware of the size of your septum and the size of your nose width in general, because you want something long enough that it's not going to fall out, but you also want something long enough to the point where it's not going to jab into your nostrils and cause lots of cutting and pain. Now, as far as like jewelry insertion goes, that can be a big trick as you get bigger in size, especially with taping, because there's no tapered end to fit in right away. You kind of just have to do it with blunt force, and that can be something tricky when pushing, because obviously you don't want to cause damage, but you still want to push enough to get it in there. So the technique or the method or whatever you want to call it that I find works best for my septum stretching with tape is that I sort of get the ledge of the plug in the hole of the piercing, and then I stick my other finger in there and sort of feel around for the full flat edge of the jewelry, and then once I can feel the whole edge, you know, sort of ease it through, I slowly push and sort of even it, level it up a little bit so it's straight, and then I slowly, very, very slowly, that's like the key to getting jewelry in with your septum, is you got to go slow. So I just pretty much slowly ease it in. And obviously, if my nose can take the size jump, it'll fit. And if not, you just have to listen to your body, take a few wraps of tape off, and try again.